So my name's Pam Moon, and I run an organisation called the Shroud of Turin exhibition, which features life-size replicas of the Shroud of Turin, which I bought from Barry Schwartz, who was the official photographer of the 1978 scientific examination of the Shroud. And the replicas show the Shroud in its life-sized form. So for instance, this one, you can see it's 15 feet long. And it contains the image of a crucified man, his front and his back. So the cloth was wrapped around the body of the man. I personally believe that this is our Lord Jesus Christ, that this is a photograph of the burial cloth of Christ. But my point of my exhibition is to use the Bible to tell the story of the passion and the resurrection of Jesus, and to use the shroud as a visual aid. So that's what I'll try and do now. So yes, the cloth wrapped around the body, going behind the body and then over the top. And it's got lots and lots of different marks on it. So for instance, these are burns from a fire which almost destroyed the shroud in 1532. You can see that it matches here, these match. And that's a really interesting thing to start with. We wouldn't normally fold a painting or a picture in half because you damage it down the centre. But throughout its history, the shroud's been stored, folded, as you can see with these burn marks. And when you get it out, it isn't damaged in any way. So let's start with the Passion and what we can learn about the suffering of our Lord. Well, the first thing that we know he suffered was the agony in the garden, where we know that his sweat was like drops of blood that fell to the ground, the excruciating agony of knowing the road to the cross that he was going to walk. And then we learn from St. John that the servant of the high priest struck him in the face. Now, if you look carefully at the face of the man on the shroud, you can see it probably more clearly in a black and white negative. There's a huge bruise here to the right cheek, which is consistent with being struck. Now, the black and white negative is actually a photographic negative. In the olden days, when before digital imagery, you used to go into a dark room and you'd have a plate which reversed the light and dark of images. And the first image, a black and white photograph that was ever taken, was by a man called Secundo Pia. And when he saw the clarity of the face on the black and white negative, he almost dropped the plate. He was so astonished by it. But so here we see this beautiful face, this beautiful face. Now, some of the scientists who've examined it have said things like, the body is very beaten up and yet the face is very serene. But even within the face, there's all forms of injuries that Jesus sustained. So we then learn that they put a crown of thorns on his head. Now, the crown of thorns you can see here, and the blood flows down the hair. You can see that there's long hair at one side of the longer than the other. But you can see the crown of thorns much more clearly on the back of the head of the man. You can see it's a really deep crown. Some people think it's a cap, but it's a really deep crown. If you look at it now, blood shows white on the black and white negative, but on the shroud itself, it shows red. Now, this image is not quite red enough. I've been privileged to see the real shroud in Turin twice in my life, and the image is clearer and the blood is redder. But that's an extraordinary thing. How do you keep blood red? Generally, dried blood will oxidize and turn brown, but this remains red. It is an extraordinary thing. Here you can see the top of the head here with the hair, and you can see the back of the head here. I talk just for a moment about the fact that you can't see the image. There are only certain colours on the shroud. You can see the burns here. You can see the colour of the linen here. You can see the image, the faint image here, and you can see the blood. But we don't know the colour of his hair. We don't know the colour of his skin. We don't know the colour of his eyes. This is a universal image. It is colourblind as an image, which I find is a beautiful thing about the shroud. So he had a crown of thorns on his head. And then there's the words that are quite haunting, really. Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged, or scourged, we say. Now, what does that look like on the shroud? Well, it's most clear on the back of the man, and particularly on the black and white negative. So if you look from the shoulders here, going right down the backs of the legs, there are all sorts of marks which look like dumbbells. So a ball at one end and a bar in the middle. They're incredibly accurate, following, in fact, some scientists have argued that you can tell the height of the executioners by the angle that these landed on the body. And the Italian medics counted them up. There are hundreds of wounds that go all the way. And also, if you look here, under the right cheek here, this is another whiplash here. It looks like a semicircle, but it's actually a whiplash. There's another one across the eye. And the significance of that to me is that Jesus taught that if someone hits you on the right cheek, offer him the other. He's not talking about being weak in the face of evil. He's saying, be strong, but do not retaliate with violence. And this is someone who practiced what he preached. So then what other injuries? Well, if you look carefully at the shoulders of the man here, you can see there are different heights. This is a normal shoulder. This is a crease here, but this is the normal line of a shoulder. And this, Italian medics have argued, is radically dislocated. So severe, they thought, that it may have caused a right-sided paralysis. Now, also, if you look across the shoulders, you can see that the marks of the whip, which are clear on the back, are smudged across the shoulders, as if there was a heavy weight across the shoulders, rubbing, which is consistent with Jesus carrying his cross. There's a plait of long hair here, not a plait, a bound long hair. He had long hair down the back. The significance of the right shoulder is that Jesus appeared to St. Bernard, and he said to him that the greatest pain that he experienced, the most excruciating pain, other than the 5 major wounds, was his right shoulder. And there's a particular prayer of blessing that's associated with the right shoulder of Jesus. But I find the depth of the whiplashes to be extremely moving. There's an Old Testament passage which says, I offer my back to those who bruise my face and pluck my beard. Can you see here that the beard in the center is pulled? It's a sign of disgrace. People, it's a sign of humiliation to pluck the beard. So this Old Testament passage finds fulfillment in the face of Jesus. Look also at the nose here. Can you see that there's a deviated septum to the nose? This face is very badly assaulted, and yet it is very serene. Okay, so the next thing, they took Jesus and they crucified him. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us a great deal about crucifixion. We know from the resurrection appearances of Jesus that he showed his disciples his hands and his feet. And in Psalm 21, it talks, which is a psalm of crucifixion, it talks about they pierced my hands and my feet. This is where the blood flows from the nail to the hand here. And it's probably low down in the hand. A French physician called Pierre Barbet discovered that if you nail somebody further up here, it doesn't necessarily hold the weight of the body, of a body, but here it goes through and holds the weight, and that's very consistent. The blood flows down from the arms from there. And then if you look at the feet, now there's 2 different wounds to the feet. If we go back onto the shroud itself here you can see what it looks like, not in the black and white negative, but you can see the blood red here and falling down there. Now there's a wound to the front of the foot here, which is very consistent with what we would see in a crucifix image, that there's a nail through the front of the foot. This is very, very badly water damaged, partly from the fire and partly from another water staining, which took place, I would argue, much earlier in the shroud's history. But if you look down at the other end, you can also see the feet here. And there's a significance to this. You see a pool of blood in the foot, in the ball of the foot, where you'd expect it to come from the front. But there's also a pool that comes sideways from the heel. Now, the significance of that is that in 1968, they discovered the remains of someone who'd been crucified in Jerusalem. His name was Yohanan, and he had a nail sideways through his heel bone, exactly like this. Also in Cambridge, in England, in 2002, they found the same remains of someone who'd been crucified, a heel bone with a nail sideways through the heel. So he was pierced, his heel bone was pierced by nails potentially, and the front of his foot as well. There may have been multiple nails. Now, we then learn that Jesus had died, and they normally, for crucifixion, in order to make sure someone is dead, you break the legs. And then you can't, to breathe in crucifixion, you have to keep lifting yourself up and down because the lungs collapse. And we know from the Gospels that when they went to Jesus, they found that he was dead and they didn't need to break his legs. There's no evidence of broken legs on the shroud. And they speared him in the side. Now, this is where the spear wound is here. This is the ellipse in which it entered, and it flows around here. And then it flows out across the back of the man here, in what's called the belt of blood. Now, the significance of it is that around all the blood stains, there's something that looks like a serum of plasma. And that's especially noticed around this. And you can see that there's a difference here between what looks like much, much lighter blood and much redder. And again, the significance of that is St. John said, out of his side flowed the water and the blood. You can see that on the shroud today. Now, Pope Francis said rather beautifully that the shroud invites us to go up to Calvary and to witness the passion. And he said, it is the face of one who is dead, and yet in the silence he speaks to us. Now, we know that the man of the shroud is dead because there's no movement in the cloth. There's no movement around the mouth. There's no movement around the chest. So this is an image of one who is dead. And I think those are most of the passion. There's a few other little things to talk about. So, for instance, scientists discovered dirt on the soles of the feet. They discovered dirt on the knees, as though he had fallen on the way to the cross. And of course, in the Stations of the Cross, we remember Jesus falling on the road to the cross. They also found dirt on the tip of the nose, and maybe this caused the wound to his nose, that as he fell, his nose hit the ground. As you meditate on the shroud, it is either the greatest piece of art on earth, or it is the burial and the resurrection cloth of Jesus Christ. Those are your choices. It is either artwork that we can't begin to replicate today, or it is Jesus, and we are looking at the face of our Lord. Left just as an imprint. St. Paul talks about we see through a glass darkly, but then we will see face to face. So what causes the image to appear on the shroud? And I'm going to sort of now move on to some of the science that's been done. As I said earlier, Barry Schwartz was the official photographer of the science done in 1978. And there were scientists from all over the world, Italian, American, and they had 5 days with the shroud. And they were trying to answer the question, what creates the image? What creates the image? Is it a painting? And they did lots of different experiments to try and work that out. So, for instance, they looked under analysis. They took areas of the blood and they looked at it and examined it, and it is blood. They spent 3 years collating all their evidence, and then peer-reviewed it in peer-reviewed journals. It is blood. It's AB blood group. It has various other attributes of blood that you would expect, like some DNA and hemoglobin. But it stays red, which is the mystery of the shroud. They shone a light through the number 3 blood stain on the forehead here and discovered that the blood, you could see the blood, it had soaked into the image, but into the cloth, but the image disappeared. And at that point, they knew that this wasn't a painting, because you would see paint through a transmitted light photograph. So they knew it wasn't paint. And they tried lots and lots of other experiments. They discovered that it's not, they fluoresced it, and all the burns showed up beautifully in the fluorescent, the image disappeared. So they knew that it wasn't created by heat. It wasn't a scorch, it wasn't a photograph, it wasn't dye. They eliminated lots and lots and lots and lots of things. And Barry Schwartz will now say, we can tell you what it's not, but we can't tell you what it is. We can't tell you what creates the image. One of the scientists took fibers of it and looked at the depth in which the image penetrates the fibers of the cloth, and discovered that it penetrates to 0.0005 of a millimeter. That's measured in nanometers. And it's 15 feet across the surface. It just touches the surface of the cloth. It's about 1/10 of the diameter of a hair on your head. What creates that? What creates that? The current head of science at Turin is a man called Paolo de Lazzaro, and he spent 5 years working with ultraviolet lasers. So massive amounts of power for billionths of a second, or 40 billionths of a second. And he would argue that it was created by some form of light, that it was like a flashes of light for a 40 billionth of a second that created it. Too much length of time, and you blow the cloth up. But to just create that, and he's managed to colour change a tiny area of linen to give the same sort of properties, not all the properties, but some of the properties that the shroud has. He openly admits that even with the technology available today, we cannot make one of these. And he would argue that as a scientist, he can't say about resurrection. He can't make resurrection happen in a laboratory. But he wants to reopen the debate. What is this? It's certainly beyond the making of a medieval forger who didn't have ultraviolet lasers. Other scientists would say it's got a radiation phenomenon. It's like it's not. The image is formed parallel to gravity, so it's like a radiation phenomenon. We don't understand. We can't go back into the tomb of Christ and witness that wonderful moment of resurrection. But the shroud maybe is its witness. So what else is there? Well, there's another cloth. If you remember back to the stories of the tomb of Christ, when St. John went in and he saw the linen lying there, and he saw, he describes it as the napkin that was around Jesus' head. This is a photograph of it, taken by Jorge Rodriguez, who's one of the world's experts on the Sudarium. And this is, without any question, the burial cloth that was around Jesus' head when he was on the cross. So this is after Jesus had died on the cross. They covered his face with a cloth. We cover the face of those who've died to give them dignity. But also it's really important in Judaism because blood is very sacred in Judaism, and you must capture the blood with the body. And so and then when they took him down from the cross, they folded it over this way, and blood came from his mouth and his nose following crucifixion. Thank you so much. If we just look over here, what does that look like on the Sudarium of Oviedo? Well, this is the back of the head, and this matches the shroud. This is the same blood group as the Shroud of Turin. It's AB. And this is the blood on the back of the head. This is the mouth. He had a spear wound through his side. Blood would have come from his mouth and his nose. This is where they folded it over. And then more blood came from his mouth and his nose as they brought him down from the cross. So these two cloths match. But the history of this is it went south out of Jerusalem, across Africa to Spain, and then north to Spain, where it is now. Whereas the shroud, we believe, went north. The only place these two cloths could have been together in the same place is Jerusalem in the 1st century. And this has a historical record going back to 1st century Jerusalem. So let's go back just for a moment, because St. John also talks about strips of linen that were found in the tomb. Now, if you look carefully at the shroud, there is a strip of linen that goes the length of the top of the shroud. Can you see that? And one of the greatest scholars of the shroud world, who discovered for the first time that the shroud has three-dimensional properties. I hope you'll be able to show that image here in this film. But he believes that the cloth wrapped the body of Christ, and then that strip was used to tie it around, to hold the body in place. And he believes that Jesus rose through the cross, through the cloth, so that when St. John went into the tomb, what he saw was the cloth laid out as they had laid Jesus out in it, but the body was no longer within the cloth. And in the resurrection appearances of Jesus, we see that he appeared through the door. He appeared to the disciples and said, "Peace be with them." Do you remember? There's another cloth which intrigues me. John Jackson would argue that the feet were tied together and then this strip was tied around the body. But there's another cloth which is called the Holy Blood of Bruges, which I have a picture of over here. And this is just a rolled up bandage of linen, which is soaked in the same colour blood as the shroud. In fact, if you zoom in on that, you can see the actual colour of the shroud much more clearly. And I've tried to argue, it may not be true, that the Holy Blood of Bruges was another strip of linen that St. John described, which tied the hands of Jesus together to hold them in place. You can see the hands are in place, which is quite consistent with a shroud burial. Now, in 1988, the shroud was carbon dated. And at that point, the carbon date results came back as 1260 to 1390. And that would mean that it couldn't be Jesus, because the cloth was manufactured years after he lived. The problem is that carbon dating is a very sensitive thing to contamination. It's only as good as the sample that is chosen. Can I show you where they took the sample from? So it is from this corner here, at the top there. That's what they cut away. And you can still see it in place on the shroud, because this is an image taken in 1978 when that was still present. And you can see just by looking at it that area there, which is where they tested it, is a different colour to the rest of the shroud. You would really want to test here. The original protocols were for 5 or more different samples taken across the shroud, but the church decided that really that was too much of an act of vandalism. Carbon dating just basically burns cloth, and it would have left patches all over the shroud. So they took this corner, and sadly, we now know one of the great shroud scientists of 1978 was given fibres from the area just next to that area called the Reyes sample, and also from the retained sample that Turin kept. And in it he found madder root dye, which is a medieval dye. He found gum tragacanth, which is a sticky gum that sticks dye to linen. He found alum. He found cotton. The shroud is 100% linen. It shouldn't have cotton in it. And so I think these are all parts of the repairs that have been done on the shroud for many years, the repairs that were done. If you look carefully, you can see the stitches of the repairs that were done from the fire damage. And there is a big question about why are the 2 corners present and 2 corners missing? Personally, I think that the fire damage caused all sorts of problems for this, and they dyed that corner to make it look like fire damage. Water damage caused a lot of problems. Now, the stitching is quite interesting, because if you look here carefully, you can see that there's multiple layers. So there's patches on top of patches, and then there's this beautiful black stitching. Now that black stitching was done in 1694 by Blessed Sebastian Valfrey, who was an Oratorian father who'd had a great devotion to the shroud. And he used to be on his knees in tears in front of it, and he did this stitching. The nuns were rather appalled because they thought people would think that they had done such awful stitching. But he served the purpose because in the Oxford photographs of the sample that was tested at Oxford University from the carbon dating, you can see evidence of Blessed Sebastian stitching. But he said, the cross took the living Jesus and returned him to us dead. The shroud took the dead Jesus and returned him to us alive. And I think that's, to me, I've studied this cloth now for 40 years, and I don't know what it is if it isn't the burial cloth of Jesus. And his blood, and his face. The Bible tells us we should seek the face of the Lord. There's one other thing which I find quite interesting. You can't see it from this angle, but this blood flow here. For years I used to think that it was just blood flow from a furrowed brow, from the crown of thorns. Now I'm not so sure. It's very difficult to get the curve on it. Now the shroud is displayed this way up, but if you turn the cloth the other way up, what you end up with is a W, like this. And that is very like the Hebrew word letter shin. And the Hebrew letter shin has enormous importance. It's the first letter of Shaddai, which is the name of God. It's the first letter of Shalom, which is the peace and the wholeness of God. It's the first letter of Shekinah, the glory of God. It's the first letter of the Shema, which is the law. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. And Jews today will put a mezuzah on the side of their doors, and on the outside casing of the mezuzah they have the letter Shin. And the significance to me of it is that St. John in the Apocalypse wrote that the people in heaven, we will see his face and his name will be written on our foreheads. I hope they will see his face and his name will be written on their foreheads. And I wonder if John in the tomb saw the letter Shin on the shroud and realized its significance. This is an image of Barry Schwartz taking the photograph of the shroud which I bought in 1978 as the official photographer in Stirp. Now this is, there's lots of pollen that's been found on the shroud. So they found pollen from all sorts of different plants, many of which grow in the Middle East and some of which bloom in the spring in Jerusalem. And around the head, they found a density of pollen from a plant, I believe called Gundelia tourneforti, which may have caused the crown of thorns. It has a very sharp spike to it. This is an example of a Roman flagrum, and you can see how it matches the dumbbell pattern. This is down the backs of the legs here. Here we have an image of Johannanan, whose heel bone they found with the nails still in it. And some examples of Roman nails, to give you an example. And I think the nail for Johannanan was about 5 inches, so about this sort of length here. This is a first century Roman nail, about that length. Now, if you look closely at the blood here, you can see much more of the red colour. The light isn't brilliant here, but you can see it much, much redder. This is much more the colour of the blood on the shroud here. And this is a close-up of what it looks like. One of the things that they discovered, which is really fascinating, is that there's no image under the blood. So they took a fibre that contained the blood, and it wasn't changed in the same way that the image fibres are changed, which means that the blood was applied to the cloth first and the image came afterwards, which fits with the idea of it wrapping Jesus after he died and then the image being created after he rose again. This is Paolo de Lazzaro, who's conducted all the experiments on lasers, trying to create the colour change in the linen. Oh, and this, I can send you a better picture of that. This is Oxford University's photograph of the sample that they tested. And if you look at it in close-up, you can see it's covered in dye, in gum, and with various bits of stitching running through it. It's highly contaminated. It should never have been tested, that area. This is an example of the type of equipment that Stirp did when they did the experiments in 1978. This is the three-dimensional image that John Jackson took in 1976 and realized that the shroud has three-dimensional properties. So it was created while it was draped over a three-dimensional figure. This is the number 3 blood stain, and you can see the blood is red and it's soaked into the cloth. But when they shone a light through it, there was no light, there was no paint, there was no density of paint in a transmitted light photograph. Now, they experimented and took microscopic levels of the shroud. So this is the background linen, this whitish colour here, and these strands here across it are what creates the image, the strands that are 1/10 of the diameter of a hair on your head. Now, if you look at them in detail, this is a fibre from the shroud which is not changed, and this is a fibre that is changed by the image. So it's a slight change to the outer surface of the fibres, fibrils, and we don't know what creates that. Over here is some of the history of the shroud. If it was Jesus, where has it been all these years? Well, I would argue with the historian Ian Wilson that before it was once known as the Holy Mandelion, and that Jesus, a king called Abgar V wrote to Jesus in the 1st century and said he was sick, would he come and heal him? And Jesus wrote back via a scribe and said that he must do his Father's will, but he would send to him. And there's a legend in the city that one of Jesus' disciples arrived with a cloth not made by hands, and the king was healed. This country became Christian. And then at a later date, the cloth disappeared and was found hidden in the city, in the walls of the city in 525 AD, and it became the most sacred cloth in the whole of Christendom. It was called the Holy Mandelion, and it was an image not made by hands. This is a 10th century image of Abgar, who wrote the letter to Jesus, holding an image of this cloth with the face of Christ on it. Now these are done around 600, this one's earlier, this is 530s probably. And you see the similarity between the face of Jesus in art and the face of the shroud. Can you see there's the long nose, the big eyes, the raised right eyebrow, the line of the mouth, the hair one side longer than the other. You can see there's often a small amount of hair at the top here. The beard, there's a sort of like a mark on the neck here. All of these signs, an art historian called Paul Vignon, identified lots of different associations between the face on the man on the shroud and these really ancient images of Christ, and believed that the shroud was the muse for these images, that they copied the shroud. I've argued for many years that this ancient image in a manuscript called the Midrash Skylitzes showed the shroud being carried through the streets of Constantinople in 1036. There was a terrible drought and people were starving. And so I believe that they got the shroud out. It had arrived in Constantinople in 944. And in 1036, they carried it across Constantinople as a means of bringing health and healing to the people. And interestingly, during the COVID pandemic, the Archdiocese of Turin showed the shroud twice on Easter Saturday in 2000 and in 2001 to act as a means of bringing grace to people. This is a lenticular image. If I just rotate that side by side, can you see that it shows the similarities between how we imagine Jesus to look and the black and white negative of the shroud?